is that this money has to come to us from the center. How can the center not fund the National Health Mission or the Education Mission or the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan or the big programs which have been announced in the last 2 years? If you have announced it, you put the money up front. That was the very blunt proposition being put across by the states. And no amount of persuasion that the center just doesn't have the resources has not so far convinced most of them, because I think they all believe, I think Professor Sen knows this more by experience, they all believe that there used to be a secret drawer in the Planning Commission from which they would pull out some money and distribute to their favorite states. That somehow, that impression has persisted, that if they persist in the negotiation, somehow someone somewhere will give more resources for development expenditures to state A or state B. Now, the second part of this impact has been in the states insisting that most of the development-oriented expenditure must come from what they call planned budgets and what here it used to be called planned transfers. This, despite the fact that 11 of them have received revenue deficit grants, all of them have received local body grants. Local body grants are still another black box. It's still being worked out. Persuasion from the Central Ministry of Panchayati Raj trying to persuade states to encourage the local bodies to make plans, improve capacities for expenditures is started, but it's going to take a bit of time. The long and short of it is that the 15-16 year has been one of immense challenges. At the same time, whether development expenditures will take place in each state to the requirement of that state is yet a very big question. The converse of it is, and the good news is, that in the very first meeting of the Niti Aayog, the newly constituted Niti Aayog, across the political spectrum, the chief ministers agreed to adopt what they called the National Development Agenda. The National Development Agenda, they committed that they will all participate. All states will participate, and the sectoral demarcation, which has now been written up in the Shivraj Singh Chauhan committee report on rationalization of centrally sponsored schemes. The sectors are predominantly those which are in the state list or at best are in the state and concurrent list. That would be poverty elimination, livelihoods, agriculture, irrigation, drinking water, sanitation, health, education, nutrition, and that I would say would form the core of the development agenda. But the political economy in the states would still drive the emphasis on sustainable programs to deliver on these sectors. That is a very big challenge. There is a greater I would say, greater push within the states, or perhaps in the center as well, to make them less sustainable and more instant noodles, 2-minute noodles types. So there has been, even in the past, a greater emphasis on what is popularly known as the Ladli Lakshmi or the mixer grinder laptop schemes, rather than make sure that you have institutions delivering healthcare or education or even your livelihood programs. Because the institutional mechanisms were more or less being pushed by the central government in some form or the other through the centrally sponsored schemes. Now, where are we going to be in 16-17? The Committee of Chief Ministers has met, one on Swachh Bharat, one on skill development, and one on rationalization of centrally sponsored schemes. Specifically on the development agenda, it has been accepted that the core programs, first the number would be reduced, second, they would all participate and put 40% share to the center, 60%. except for the 11 states, the 8 northeastern states and the 3 Himalayan states, who would continue to get 90% of the central share in schemes which address the sectors they have identified as the national development agenda. How much will be the center's ability to garner resources for this basket of schemes depends on huge number of factors, which I'm sure my co-panelists would be able to project with little more clarity. From what it looks like, the current year's apportionment of about 26% of the union budget to plan, with about half or more to the central sector, and about 1.7 lakh crores, which is much less than what went down in 14-15 to the much maligned centrally sponsored schemes. I don't think this is going to rise very much farther. Now, if within that agendas have to be national, then the question really is, can the central government persuade all states to invest in these sectors, in the schemes, to the extent that that is required, not to the extent which the states are willing. That is a question. And whether the central government has the power of persuasion to push the states to do so without any lever on the allocation side. That is a very difficult question. Such as it is, the Niti Aayog does not, we don't do allocations, as they say, we don't do windows, but we have had very good experiences in interacting with the states, and we think that it's going to get better, because suddenly the states, after having bitterly complained to the Finance Commission about the Planning Commission and its evil ways, have suddenly found that at least there was a place or someone that they could call and blame for what has happened or not happened. Niti Aayog is more of a compatriot and a friend, so they can at best come and cry on our shoulders. But whether the advice that will be given and the hand-holding that will be done will be effective or not, we hope it will. We hope that this kind of a more equitable relationship will hold, but will it hold without the sweeteners of money, for which we will have to persuade the finance ministry to cough up or not, is a big challenge going forward in the, at least for development expenditures in the states, in the change scenario post-14th Finance Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Khullar. May I now invite Professor Abhirup Sarkar.
Thank you. The main issues have already been raised, and the main feature of the 14th Finance Commission has already been mentioned. I'll just for my ease my analysis, I will try to summarize what the 14th Finance Commission's recommendations entail. I think it entails a philosophical change. Basically, a shift towards fiscal autonomy for the states. As Pinaki pointed out, the total remains the same, but the states get to decide their fates more independently than before. So that means an increase, 42% of tax proceeds will go to the states, as opposed to 32% proposed by the 13th Finance Commission. And at the same time, a fall in centrally sponsored schemes. So basically, it means that the center wants to, the way I see it, the center wants to move to a regime of rules rather than discretions. Previously, you had discretion, the center had discretion. Whenever there are grants to be transferred, center bargaining was important. Which state would bargain more, bargain harder, that would partly determine how much money would go to that state. And also, there were political economy aspects. The center or the party in power could, at least theoretically speaking, favor states where the same party is in power, or in a coalitional setup, regional parties which were friendly to the center, they might get more money. So that kind of possibility was always there with discretion. And there are some empirical work, serious empirical work. I am reminded of one, at least I'll mention one, by Arulampalam, Dasgupta, Dhillon and Datta, which came out in the Journal of Development Economics in 2009. This is in the Indian context. Basically, they identify two types of states in India, which are sort of sufferers from this discretionary transfer. One type of state is basically the one which has a different political party in power than at the center. So if you have two different parties in power, one at the center and the other at the state, empirically they have shown, this paper has shown that transfers are less. Second, if there is a party for which political change is less likely, the probability of a change in power is low, then again it is getting less. It could be the same party as at the center or a different party. And the reason is clearly, reason is simple. If I suppose I'm at the center and I know that this party at one particular state cannot be changed, so there is not much point in giving more aid to that, to that state. So these are the two types of states which have got less on political economic grounds, and this paper, they have come up with sound empirical, proof of that. So now that the center is moving towards a rule-based system, I think part of this, these problems would be removed. In India, as I see it, with regional parties becoming stronger, the chances are higher that there are different parties at the center and at the state. So this problem of misallocation would be partly solved by moving towards rules rather than discretions. This is number one. Also, there are states, backward states, let's say, where you have large informal sectors. And people in these informal sectors depend on the ruling party in all sorts of ways. You are selling your ware on the streets, or you are driving an auto rickshaw without a license, or even if you are doing honest business, you are not insulated from the local goons. So all these things need political support. You need political support of the party in power, of the local party in power, just to survive. And given that, whenever there is a party in power, there is a tendency that most of these people, the voters, would move towards that party. So there is sort of contagious behavior on the part of the voters, which makes political change less likely. So, given if we sort of grant that political change is less likely for states which are backward with larger informal sectors, then again this discretionary transfers would be a problem for these states, and the new system of moving towards rules would at least partly solve the problem. So, up to here, I think it's a better system. I welcome the system. I know, I understand very well that the total kitty has not increased, but the philosophy has changed, giving more autonomy to the state. The state can sort of determine their own destiny. This is fine. On the flip side, you see, it has already been mentioned maybe in an implicit way, but I'll just put it in a slightly different way. This, shift from discretion to rules at the central level, that is more rule-based fund going to the states, would mean more discretion within the state. So, now if you look at the state, how the money is going to flow within the state, now you have more discretion at the state level, okay, rather than rules. Like, earlier on we had this National Health Mission, Education Mission, and so on, where the states were bound to spend money. Now it's states' discretion where to spend money. So the political economy problems that I mentioned at the center and state level would be very much valid within the state itself. We had, with Pranab Bardhan, Dilip Mukherjee, Sandip Mitra, I did some, survey, and we found out in West Bengal, we found out that there are indeed misallocation of funds within the state. Number one, areas with more political competition would get more funds. If it's one-sided, for example, if it's just, where the opposition is weak, for example, they would get less funds. Also, the benefits are often given on a patron clientele basis. We got evidence for that also. There are other problems as well. See, when you have discretionary fund, there is a tendency to spend more money on construction rather than maintenance. This is a general phenomenon. Construction would give you more political mileage. It would give you more, visibility, rather than maintaining an old road or, whatever, old facility. So there also there could be misallocation of resources. So I would have thought that, if along with moving towards a rule-based system, as far as movement of funds from the center to the state is concerned, along with that, if some direction or, some kind of direction or some compulsion were there for the states, exactly how to spend that money, exactly where to spend that money, that would have helped. Maybe that would have encroached upon the autonomy of the states, but one could think of broad enough guidelines where in the long run states would have developed more more smoothly. So my basic point is that even with schemes like NREGA, there are evidences that there have been political favors, like regions which are sort of where the panchayats are ruled by the ruling party itself, there are states where these regions are getting more funds. So if that happens with NREGA, that could happen with fund where the state has full discretion. So while I fully welcome this shift towards rule-based allocation of funds, I'm slightly, I wouldn't say slightly, I am apprehensive about the way this fund would be spent at the state level. Because if you give full discretion to the states, the same political economic questions would come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sarkar. Professor Abhijit.
Okay, most of it has been said already, so I don't really have much. But let me just start off from the simple fact. I was a member of the 14th Finance Commission, and I was the sole dissenter to that Commission's report. My dissent, however, had nothing to do with the broad objectives and the broad vision of that Commission. Essentially, that Commission had done 5 things, all of which have been noted. First, increase devolution. Second, bring in plan transfers on the basis of which revenue deficit transfers by the Finance Commission are worked out, so that in a sense you incorporated part of what was already the plan transfers. Get rid of, or rather not talk about, special category states at all in the Finance Commission report. Do not have any grants other than the revenue deficit grant and the grants to local bodies and for disasters. And don't put any conditionalities on grants. And finally, look for institutions which can do better fiscal coordination and also cooperative federalism. I think these were the 5 things on which the 14th Finance Commission differed from its previous avatars. Now, all of which I incidentally agreed with. My disagreement was and mainly that was it, that here was something, what was that Commission ended up doing was taking roughly 1% of GDP from the centre's tax revenues and giving it to the states. In a situation in which the total plan expenditures were roughly around 5%. At its best, and many times it's less than that. And that clearly this would obviously mean that there would be a fair amount of disruption. And this disruption has happened, as Sindhu has told you. And that this needed time. If you need time to do anything, you need something which says that A, do all of the things we want to, but have an end date by which you would have done it, and have a carrot for the end date when you do it. So what I had recommended was, don't go for 42, go for something in between the 32 which already existed and that 42. I suggested a number 38. So that would give the states a fairly large shift. And then move to 42 when the new succeeding institution, the institution which succeeded the Planning Commission, has decided, in this case the Niti Aayog, is comfortable with an equilibrium. At which point, move to 42. I mean, that was basically the recommendation. Now, the reason I did dissent on those lines was mainly because my experience with the Planning Commission. And also my experience with the Finance Commission. As a member of the, when I joined the Finance Commission, I was concurrently a member of the Planning Commission. And there is no institution in India that I could ever think of which was so thoroughly opposed to the Planning Commission, and it came out of everybody's mouth about it. They hated that institution completely. Now, when you have evidence of people you've known for very long, guys you can work around with, and see something which is so, it is so deeply ingrained that you don't even want to talk about it. Inherently, the one question I kept asking, which is when you make a change like this, there is an aftermath, and there has to be institutions which adjust to these changes. And can't we at least discuss what is likely to happen? Well, the instant answer was no, that's not our job. Our job is simply to give a recommendation on the things. After that, the states and the center can sort it out themselves. Fine, except that it takes time. And I think Sindhu has more or less said that it has taken the time. There are problems that I think Abhirup has also mentioned. What are the sort of problems which come from the other end? So that's all been said. So now looking forward, I agree completely with Pinaki that I think at this point, at least till the next year's budget is presented both by the center and the states, and we know what the revised estimates of expenditures are, we can't say a damn thing about what has actually happened to any of the expenditure side. So that's not something that I want to get in, which is what has happened so far. I don't think we can say anything about it. But I think what we do need to discuss, and I think that's probably where what I'm saying is not just, it's something which I think is going to be an issue which will live for some time, which is how do you fill a gap between these two institutions? Finance Commission, a constitutional body, which for a 5-year period mainly gives the states a share of central taxes. And the Planning Commission, a body which tries to actually work out a development plan and gets states and the center to try and work towards that development plan. These two are very different roles. One is simply an allocative role on the sharing of taxes. The other is a direction on where should we want to go, and if we want to go there, what should be the resources available, and how do we make those resources? How do we actually allocate those resources across competing claims? Now, what has happened is that on the second of this, as Sindhu said at the end, what we've got is an organization which is possibly still competent to think of what ought to be the objectives and even probably what should be the structure of it. But unfortunately, it ends up without any allocative role, without very much in the way of convincing people or forcing people to do what they want. Now, force might be a bad thing. It runs exactly opposed to autonomy, but that's where the point that he made, which is that sometimes, unfortunately, planning does require the space in which you can force certain things through. And I think that's where we are at the moment. We have that organization is, in some sense, without the instruments with which it could work earlier. Now, into all of this is something which, except for Pinaki, nobody said anything, is the change on the revenue side, that is the GST. The GST is one of those things which is an economist's delight. It is a delight in the sense that, you get rid of distortions, you have few rates and common rates across the country, common market. It has huge efficiency effects. But it is also something, obviously, which hugely